All right, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know people are still joining, but just in the interest of time, welcome to today's session with the Muscadine, North Carolina Muscadine Association. My name is Kyle Friedman. I've been a part of the association and just helping out with a lot of these workshops and conferences. So it's nice to see some familiar names and meet some new people. Just a brief overview of just how we're using Zoom for these sessions. Pretty straightforward. I know a lot of you are accustomed to using Zoom. So we're just using the meeting function. Feel free to turn your camera on if you'd like us to see you. If not, that's no problem. We'll keep everyone muted during the presentations. We are taking questions at the end of the presenter's time. So feel free during the presentation. If questions come to you, you can just enter those in the chat box and we'll make sure that we gather those, as well as at the end of the session. If you feel inclined to turn your mic off and ask a question out loud, that's fine. We are recording this session and so, or these sessions, and so we will be posting this and providing the recording if you want to reference later. And I think that's probably about it. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to Debbie to just introduce today's topics, and then we'll get moving.
Hold on. What is that? Hold on, I'm trying to disconnect this phone. Sorry about that. I thought I had all my phones disconnected. So hey everybody, I'm Debbie Wexler. I'm Executive Secretary of the North Carolina Muscadine Grape Association, and I'm delighted to have you all here. This is one of several sessions that we've been doing this summer. We started off with a production-related summer chores in the vineyard. We've been doing a number of sessions, particularly related to growing for wine and producing wine. And we have a session tomorrow on the essentials of muscadine winemaking. If that's something you're interested in and you've not signed up for it, we do have, you can let me know and I'll make sure you get the information about it. As part of that program, we're also have some special offers for North Carolina growers, particularly those who are involved in wine, for Brooks refractometer, for free analysis of your juice from your grapes. So, North Carolina growers who grow for wine, that grant funded project has some really good benefits for you. So, make sure you know about it. In terms of fresh market, besides this, we are planning to have another session a little bit later, probably later part of August, on value-added processing, doing it yourself, rules for doing it, having other people process your grapes or create jams, jellies, juices for you. We know there's been a lot of interest in creating juice, farm produced juice. There are a lot of rules and hoops that make that difficult. And so we'll be talking about all of that. And then later on in August, we also have a number of sessions for home muscadine growers and home winemakers. I'll put the link up to the event section of our website, but we've got sessions in August for both of those groups. You can take part in them or spread the word as you wish. And I think that's all for me as introduction. I will be putting some links and resources in the chat so that you can be sure to have those websites or web pages where you can find the information. I think that's it. I'll turn this over to our first speaker, who I believe is Penny. Penny Perkins from NC State University at the Plants for Human Health Institute in Kannapolis, our supreme post-harvest person here in North Carolina. Go for it, Penny.
Okay, let's see, share. Okay, so I'm going to go here. First, I wanted to, just introduce myself. Debbie's already done most of it. We're located at the research campus in Kannapolis. So as you can see, it's fairly impressive in looks. I do a lot of post-harvest work in fresh fruits and vegetables, and with North Carolina State Department of Horticulture, located down at Kannapolis. So, and muscadine happens to follow under. I do a lot of small fruit research, and I tend to think of muscadines under the small fruit umbrella. The first thing I want to point out for those of you who you guys may already know this, but for those who are not familiar with this, muscadines are not a bunch grape. There's a bunch grape here. You know, easy to see these long, lovely bunches of grapes. This is a muscadine. This is actually a pretty nice looking bunch of muscadines because normally there's one or two or three, and you have to kind of sometimes lift the leaves to find them. But the most important thing is they're harvested singly. They're not in a bunch. So when you harvest them, they're not going to have the rachis attached. They're going to be just single berries. And I'm going to skip down here. Slip skin and seeded. Again, table grapes in the United States tend to be seedless. They tend to not have a slip skin. These two things are changing slowly in the muscadine world, but this is the way it is right now. The bricks on the muscadines is actually pretty similar to table grapes. It's running anywhere from 13 to 24%. And then the other thing to remember is because we are removing the rachis, then there's a stem scar. This is a major source of tearing, especially if they're not ripe or if it's the wrong variety. You get juice leak and decay because of that tear many times. The other key component is just like any other table grape or other small fruits, you need refrigeration. And unlike bunch grapes, we have a shelf life of weeks, not months, primarily because we have that lovely hole in the stem, but we can't use sulfur dioxide or the equivalent of sulfur dioxide like we can in bunch grapes. Whenever you use it, even with the sheets, you get bleaching. And if you do have, there are some new products, but they haven't been shown to be any more useful than having nothing at all. So we still have this conundrum of a limited shelf life. And this is what happens when you have a hole in your, this is a typical stem scar. This one's actually dry. But what over time what you get is this lovely little pile of mold if you have a problem. I want to make this little option right here. We discussed this a little bit about how to handle this. Just want to point out to remember that field sanitation is important before you even choose your site and at all stages of production. And Drs. Johnson and Simmons will talk about more about sanitation and food safety after this. For fresh market and direct sales, there are key points that apply to both systems. One is that dry stem scar, keeping the juice off the grapes. The other is about washing, and I'm going to say this very carefully. Remember that unlike raspberries and blackberries, they're easy to wash by consumers. So if you're thinking about incorporating a wash step, think about it twice. And I'm sure Drs. Johnson and Simmons will talk about this because there are other caveats involved when you start including a wash step in your system. And also the key thing, I have seen so many of these, please remember to use fresh market varieties. Do not use Carlos and Noble. These are processing varieties. They're great for processing. They're terrible for fresh market, and you'll end up with a bunch of juice at the bottom of your box if you use these. So please stick with those. So what are the types that we use for fresh market? They usually fall into three colors, bronze, purple, and red. So bronze types include anywhere from a very green type, such as Granny Val, some others such as Summit, which can also go a little too pink as it ages. You also have Late Fry, which is a good later variety. Triumph, Fry, Hall is a really nice one that came out of Georgia. And these are very Intera, which these are very acceptable, and they've been around for many years. I think Hall's probably the most recent of these varieties. The purple types, there are fewer of these for fresh market right now. Again, Georgia has released Polk and Lane, and these are excellent fresh market varieties. And then also Supreme and Nesbitt, which is a smaller variety, is still used a lot as a fresh market grape. The reds are less popular in general for fresh market. There's a kind of a view that because some of these like Summit will go pink over time, the reds are kind of viewed a little bit with suspicion that these might be overripe, and it's kind of an educational process. There's two pretty good ones out there right now, Scarlet and Ruby Crisp, both from Georgia. So this is a market that may increase over time with more red varieties. But right now it's primarily bronze and purple. I would say when I used to talk to Irvin about this, and he was getting a lot more orders for purple varieties from his distributors than he was for bronze. But both are pretty commonly known here. The seedless muscadines are making an appearance now. There's some new commercial vines going in. These are mostly right now is Oh My, which is a bronze type, fairly large fruit, a little bit smaller than Triumph, for instance. Razzmatazz is a very small red variety. And it reminds you a little bit more of a champagne type grape. Very tasty. They have the same shelf life and they have the same, shouldn't quite see, 0 to 4 centigrade, so about the same storage temperature for as seeded. And the shelf life is similar, 14 to 21 days, probably closer to 28 days for seedless and seeded, the better varieties. So these are coming along. There's a new purple one that I hope will be released. The size is getting bigger, by the way, in seedless grapes. So more to come on that. Fresh market sales, going to talk a little bit about fresh market. There's more to pay attention for if you're doing fresh market sales, I think, than you pick. The key points for fresh market, you have to have hand labor. We don't have mechanized systems yet for muscadine grape. It's going to be a few years more before we get it right. And we don't have too much damage from impacts. You have to harvest early to reduce field heat. So muscadines ripen anywhere from mid-August to mid-October. October is not a problem so much for heat, but boy, it's really a problem between August and September. So it's really important to get out there early before field heat builds up, before you get to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, because you've got to remove that field heat later. So the less you build, the less you have to remove. And then you have to cold store it as well. So 0 to 5 C, so that's between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 41 degrees Fahrenheit. If you go higher than that, you're not going to have much of a shelf life. You're going to get softening. The packaging for clams is mostly clamshells, vented clamshells, 1 pound size. This is the most common system right now for muscadine. There are some people who will do kind of a lug system, but those seem to be more showing up at farmers market only. And again, I put a very conservative storage life on here, 7 to 21 days. Most of the fresh market varieties will last at least 14 days, and we can go to 28 days pretty easily. Sometimes we can even go to 36 days. But you do have a limited time here, so you do have to move those grapes. It all depends a lot, of course, as you know. Variety first, the amount of heat units that you've built up and removed, and also sometimes the stage of ripeness in the field. If you're at the 3rd harvest of the grapes, you may have a shorter shelf life. The soluble solids or bricks should be between 13 and 18%. So what you want here for fresh market is they want to be full purple color. You don't want a half purple one. This is sometimes a problem with some of the purple grapes, is getting the right color, right development of color on these. Lane and Polk tend to be a little bit easier to get full color to see on these than Supreme, for instance. For the bronze types, this is pretty much perfect right here. What you have here is a little bit of green, but these have that touch of bronze that makes them so attractive to a consumer. When these green types be something more like almost a Granny Val, which is kind of a problem with Granny Val because consumers sometimes think it's underripe. And this is the other extreme. These have sat around too long. Now they're fully brown. The sugars have gone up on them, but more importantly, they're soft and starting to get leaky. If you want to measure your soluble solids or sweetness, here's a refractometer that's commonly used for, still used in the field. It's relatively inexpensive, usually less than $50. Hold it up to your eye, look into the light. For those of us who can't see that way anymore, there's a digital version available. They run anywhere from $100 to $300. So a big difference in price, but also a big difference in ease of handling. So that's if you want to follow your sugars, that's one way to do it, probably the easiest way. If you're doing U-pick sales, it's really more about, for U-pick, there's 2 major things to worry about. One is show your customers the right color and ripeness to pick. Train your customers. You probably already know this, but the customers are going to come in. Most have never seen a muscadine or have not even been in the field nowadays. So you have to show them everything. And you don't want to lose sales because they picked a bunch of green ones and threw them on the ground. And you certainly don't want them tasting them in the field. We're trying to discourage that because of food safety issues. So it's really important that they know what the ripeness should be of what they're picking. Make sure your containers that you are using are unused or clean, indoor clean. And then really the containers here, as you can tell, are generally bigger. You can use a 1 pound clamshell, but lots of times U-pick sales are bigger sizes because customers think they're getting more of a bargain that way, and they'll spend longer in the field if they have a bigger container to pick into. So 1 gallon box has been used before. This is a pretty nice container because it's not going to tip on you and you can walk away with it, but of course it's going to be more costly for you as a producer. The bucket and the bag is a pretty common system. It's used for strawberry. It's moved over to grapes. The idea is that you can use a clean bag. You line a cleaned bucket with it. You can reuse the bucket as long as it's cleaned. Put your bag into it, and then the customer walks away with the bag of grapes and leaves the bucket. And I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong on how to do this with all the food safety people. Common to both of these, some of these show up in the field, some of these show up post-harvest, unmarketable berries. You'll see shriveled berries on the vine sometimes if they've been there a long time. Pretty common sign of weight loss and storage. Leaky also will show up sometimes on the vine. Let me see there. And then also we have the browning issue that we talked about. This will show up in storage over time. You'll get these very brown fruit by 36 days sometimes. But sometimes you'll see this happen in the field a little bit less advanced. Stem scar tears, pretty much this is going to be a post-harvest issue. There are some varieties that will get this blackening around the stem scar. It's not leaky, but it turns a kind of an ugly black. For most of them, though, the big problem is they leak and then you get decay forming almost always at the stem scar first. And occasionally you see splits. This again is a post-harvest problem and tends to show up pretty late in the post-harvest life. So quickly, there are grading standards for muscadines, those of you who are doing fresh market sales, and may have to worry about this. US #1, the key here is there's two unusual things about muscadine is the soluble solids content has been set at 13% so that we don't have unripe berries entering the market. The other part is not excessively soft. So muscadines do tend to soften as they sit around, as they ripen. That's probably the #1 problem. Let's see. So quickly into storage temperature. A few things about storage temperature. The #1 thing, and I actually probably should put this first, plan for this in advance of harvest. So this is one reason it was important to have this webinar before the harvest starts. Too many times I've seen people underestimate how much production they're going to have and have nowhere to put it. So make sure that you have thought about refrigeration. Even if you have a U-pick, you run into situations where you might need that refrigeration if you have a rainy day or if you have advanced sales you want to make. Make sure you have the right refrigeration capacity for your heat load and the volume of fruit. And those, I didn't put it here. There is a website you can go to calculate this, work through your heat load and volume calculations to figure out what you need. The most important thing here is the higher your temperature during storage, the shorter your shelf life. So if you're close to freezing at 33 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to have 20 days. You're going to have 1/5 of that if you're holding these fruit at 68 degrees or room temperature. Very important to remember that. If you can move your fruit quickly, do it. But otherwise, plan to keep it cold. And then the other thing here to remember is cool quickly, and forced air is best. That's why I'm putting this last, because the next slide's on forced air. And then follow it by low temperature storage. Remember, these fruit can be held next to freezing, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and they can go a little bit higher, but you don't want to go above 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't hold them with your tomatoes. I would definitely recommend don't do that. Here's a forced air system. You can do it yourself. You can make a really small system yourself by basically taking a box fan, creating a tunnel system with a tarp. You have 2 rows of fruit here on pallet, or these are pallets, but you can use, even masters of fruit. We've done this before. Basically, you want to direct your exhaust to be going out. So you're pulling cold air in. You have these in a cold room, pulling cold air through and around the fruit. These are the commercial size scale here. As you can see, the vacuum, there's a little bit of a vacuum that's created when you put this tarp over the system. Okay, and then one last thing I wanted to talk about here, because this is commonly used by a lot of people now, CoolBot systems. The idea here is you attach this device to a room air conditioning unit, and what you're doing is pulling that room air conditioning unit to go below 60 degrees. However, I have to go back now, I had to add this. The limit is 36 degrees Fahrenheit. We've not been able to pull anything lower than this. So do not depend on this as a really good source of cold air. It's great for stuff that's on the edge. That you're going to be okay with in this range, but it's going to be a little bit tight if you're holding fruit and you're trying to get it close to freezing. It's not going to work for you. These units run $300 to $600. The AC units may have gone up now, and then the CoolBot itself. You could only buy it from this website, which, by the way, is a great source of post-harvest ideas. and how to build things like coolers, everything you can think of. I think they're now available. I've seen them available on other websites now. I think even Amazon has these, so they're easier to get than they were. I want to wrap this up with some other sources of post-harvest information that are out there. Muscadines are covered in the USDA Handbook 66. I was just on the UC Davis produce fact sheets and I saw bunch grapes, but I didn't see muscadines listed here. However, this is a good, useful place to go because they explain a lot of the decays that show up in bunch grape, some of which may also happen in muscadine. And also the grading standards are right here. And I'm going to stop share right now. And then I'll open this up for questions. Okay, so there's a bunch of questions on here.
Great, thank you, Penny.
Okay. Okay, so first question, elaborate on why Carlos and Noble are not ideal. First is size, they're little berries, they're processing berries. So it'd be like trying to make a wine grape into a table grape. And the other is they're very, very soft. And they also tend to be quite leaky, especially Carlos. It will leak a lot at the stem end. It's got a wet stem scar. Okay, so here's another one. On field heat, Lane, Southern Jewel. Okay, that's interesting. You're reporting that you're having more of a wet stem scar and tearing issue by picking in the early morning as opposed to not picking in the early morning. Lane, I haven't seen that on. I haven't worked with Southern Jewel at all. I guess I would ask here. I'm not sure, is this in this, well, Lane would be in the summer months, September. So I would assume that you have a fairly warm temperature where you are. The only time I could see this not happening is if you're in a wet mountain somewhere where it's much cooler in the morning, like 50. Okay, is there current research testing for mechanical harvesters for muscadine? Yes, there's a little bit of this going on. Arkansas had one many, many years ago. I'm thinking like in the early 80s, they had a muscadine harvester. The biggest problem, and there's also some muscadine harvesting going on for processing. The big problem, of course, with these is how do you pick a vine effectively and how do you keep the drops from happening? The more times you drop a fruit, the more likely it is to get bruised and to soften. So this is going to be the problem. And then the last one that's going to be a problem with muscadine is they're mostly grown in small acreages. So you have to have a fairly small mechanical harvester, which is a little bit tougher. My understanding is a little bit tougher to do economically. Let's see. I think that's all I have right now, unless anybody has some other questions to add.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of those were my own selfish questions, but I appreciate your answers to those. Very interesting. Anyone else have questions before we move on? All right. Well, thank you, Penny.
Okay, great. Let's see.
So our next presenters, we'll move on to Lynette and Chip. So Lynette, I'll pass it over to you.
So Lynette and I are going to actually tag team this presentation, and I will try to jump in first. And for the record, Penny did an excellent job with the bag and the bucket. That one of the things that we always try to stress to folks is to keep the harvest containers up off the ground for other commodities like strawberries and such. And that does a great job by having a liner like that. So Lynette and I talked about some of the important things to go through during this talk, and we wanted to include some recommendations both for pick your own as well as retail markets, because oftentimes those happen in the same vineyard. So we want to try to talk about some of the things that would be applicable to both. Certainly, we think food safety is very important for both of these, really to minimize the risk of food safety hazards, because oftentimes the fruit is not further processed. It could be eaten raw, and so those microbial hazards, could expose the folks eating those. Grapes are covered under the newer Food Safety Modernization Act, Produce Safety Rule. They're one of the so-called covered commodities. And so depending upon the size of your farm, there's a very good chance that you would be covered under that rule. If depending upon the size of the farm and the amount that you sell, and to whom you sell to, there's a very good possibility that you could be qualified exempt from a good part of the rule, but that's really a topic for another day. And then one of the other considerations are that depending upon who you sell to, some of your retail markets may require a third-party audit or so-called GAP audit, GAP certification. So if there are questions about that, Debbie had talked about doing another seminar series to talk specifically about GAP certification for grapes. And if there's enough interest in it, then we'll certainly try to plan one of those and try to help out with that. Cool. So when we talk about pick your own versus retail sales, one of the first big differences is how you might convey health and hygiene practices to the folks that might be on the farm. Really for your workers, that gets down to worker training. And so, sorry, I have a toddler that is here knocking on the door. So glad this is very informal. Hold on just a quick second. Sorry. So really, when you're dealing with your workers versus your visitors, I always get a little uncomfortable with the pick your own operations because you have a lot less control over the visitors. The way that you try to convey information to them really is through signage. You can put the signs out, you can have your rules set, but there's no way really to ensure that your policies will be covered by that. Where with workers, if you observe them doing something, then you could actually go back and retrain. Next slide, please. One of the other differences is actually how you might restrict access to farms. And the reason that would be important is because, especially during the COVID era that we have going on now, and Lynette will talk a little bit more about COVID policies and things like that later on. But some of your visitors, some of the patrons may actually be less comfortable being around the farm workers that are there and even around other customers. And so by having designated areas for folks to pick in and having those spread out in the field, hopefully you could alleviate some of those concerns. You can segregate your harvesters and visitors either temporally, so you could have the harvesters, your farm workers out there during certain times of the day, and then have other times of the day open for your visitors. Or you could actually have them separated physically. So you would designate parts of the field that for the workers versus the visitors. Next slide, please. Invariably, with customers, they'll want to sample some of the products, and this is a point that Penny had actually hit on earlier. From a food safety standpoint, and with worker training for non-UPIC operations, it's not allowed, both with GAP certified farms as well as under the FSMA rules. It's not allowed to actually have workers eat in the fields. And so the same can be said for your visitors as well. It's not a good idea to have them consuming any of the fruits while in the field. Certainly, if you do have samples for them available, they should be cleaned. All the areas should be cleaned and sanitized. Lynette will talk more about cleaning and sanitizing in the next section. And the samples should be stored in coolers. Penny pointed out the importance from a product quality standpoint of being able to have those refrigerated. Next slide, please. So both for your visitors as well as for your workers, hand washing is critical. One of the points that Penny made was that we don't have mechanical harvesters at this time for these. So the number one food contact surface are the workers' hands or the visitors' hands. That's going to touch every piece of fruit that goes off the farm. It's important to have hand washing stations both where your workers and your visitors enter the vineyard, enter in, as well as around any restrooms or around porta potties, things like that. The station should include clean water, and by definition, under the Food Safety Modernization Act rules, it should be potable or no detectable generic E. coli. There should be soap there. If you use paper towels for hand drying, then there should be a trash can for that to be able to contain that. And there should be some containment basin or bucket for the wastewater that's generated from hand washing. And again, one of the things that I'll keep going back to is signage. It's really, really important to have hand washing. Please, Lynette. The next logical thing that we should talk about are restrooms. So you should have enough restrooms for both visitors and workers. Those should be readily accessible. They should be stocked with proper supplies. They should be routinely cleaned. And actually, by including a restroom cleaning log for your visitors, your customers to see, that will kind of show and convey that to them, give them a more of a sense of security. We always talk about toilets must not serve as a source of contamination. So we often talk about, the placement of these, particularly porta potties, portable restrooms. It would be important if there's any difference in grade on the farm that you actually put these down grade, because you always have to plan for the what ifs. What if your porta potty turns over? How are you going to contain that? So if you're downgrade, certainly it's much easier to contain. With other commodities like strawberries, we've actually seen growers put a berm around the field and actually put the restrooms outside the berm, so that if it were to turn over, that berm would direct that wastewater away from the field. So thinking about the placement of the restrooms and the traffic flow for folks to get back and forth to those is important. Next slide, Lynette. So we talk about a sick policy. Should have a sick policy in place both for workers as well as visitors. Again, signage will convey that to your visitors. Worker training, can help convey that to your workers. Things that you should really look out for: diarrhea, jaundice, certainly vomiting. Now in the COVID era, any signs that you might see with that, coughing and things like that. but as a policy, anyone that's sick should not be in the vineyard. Next slide, please. For handling money, workers must wash their hands between direct handling of money and produce. At other types of U-Pick operations, other types of farm stands, I've seen workers try to use gloves and try to put the gloves on and off. That's just a recipe for disaster. Really, if there's any way possible, it would be better for one person to handle money and never touch produce, and then have others that would actually handle produce directly. Next slide, please. We always get questions about pets. People love to bring their pets to farms, but certainly that is not a very good policy. For some reason, down east, a lot of the farms that I work with down east, it seems to be worse down in the eastern part of the state. People try to slip their pets in, saying that they're service animals, and they'll argue up one side and down the other that these are truly service animals. Service animals should be allowed on farms, and we have a couple of examples in a second of signage that can be used that are approved by the ADA, American Disabilities Act. But if there are service animals that are there, some of the rules that should be followed is they should be leashed, and any waste that they might generate should be disposed of in designated areas, trash cans and such. Next slide, please. Rather than reinventing the wheel, these are a couple of the signages for service animals that are ADA compliant. These are from Rutgers University, and we can provide links for those if you're interested. Next slide, please. And then finally, we need to talk about animals other than domestic animals, wildlife. So for vineyards, really, I have pictures here of deer. Fencing can help deter wildlife. Really, the ones for grapes that we might be most interested in would be birds. With the grapes being up off the ground, certainly things like rabbits, maybe deer, you could argue, are probably less important than comes down to fecal contamination. So we would be interested in looking for any bird poop that might be in certain areas. You would encourage your customers to notify you any signs of animal intrusion or droppings in the field, and then try to convey the importance of not harvesting that. One of the other questions we get, which is we always advise, is that any dropped produce, any produce that goes to the ground should not be harvested. That should not be picked up and used. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lynette, and hopefully she won't have the same issues with a toddler coming into her office.
No, I'm just surprised that I actually have, colleagues in the office. So you might hear some background voices. So thanks, Chip. We're going to continue on the presentation with the topic of cleaning and sanitizing. This is certainly, if there's, I don't take it lightly, but if there's any sort of silver lining in the food industry with the COVID pandemic, it is certainly, certainly the fact that there's been an increased awareness of cleaning and sanitizing. Okay, whether or not we're doing any better, our procedures are any better, I don't know, that's debatable, but certainly there's an awareness of, not only cleaning, sanitizing, but that importance of disinfection, which we'll talk about in just a second. But as far as, keeping things safe, keeping our food safe, it's so very important that we understand like Chip mentioned, those food contact surfaces. And we have to consider what kind of containers are we using. So, for example, one-time use containers, paper-based or plastic materials for retail markets or fresh markets, right? Many of those containers are only meant for one-time use, okay? If they are not cleanable nor sanitizable, in other words, can you get them wet? Can we actually remove, the residue? And even farther, can we actually remove bacteria? That gets into sanitizing. So, these examples here are examples of containers that would only be used one time because they're not cleanable, okay? So certainly do not reuse those containers that are meant for one-time use. And then I think what's so very important, we have those containers that might be left over from one harvest, we're able to store them till the next year, for example. Just make sure you're storing those food containers in a protected, clean, and covered area. And certainly while in use, keep them off the ground. For those, containers that we are going to be reusing, okay, this is where, our procedures for proper cleaning and sanitizing come into play. So in many cases, some vineyards will provide a container, and I agree with Chip. Kudos to Penny. That was a great picture showing the liner in the bucket. That is probably the best case scenario there. That way you don't have to worry or be so vigilant about your cleaning and sanitizing procedures for food contact surfaces. Those consumers could just take that bag home with them and they're on their merry way. So, for those reusable plastic containers, make sure you're using clean water and a sanitizer according to the sanitizer's label. Okay, and I'm going to get into more on that in regards to what we mean by the label. All right. So one thing to start with, okay, and I get that there's a variety of commodities shown here, but always when you're considering your cleaning and sanitizing program, it's first and foremost, okay, so important to start with, those high risk areas. And in regards to ready to eat products like muscadines, like fresh muscadines, okay, you need to identify those food contact surfaces. Those are your highest risk surfaces, meaning that if your food contact surfaces are contaminated, that can then cross-contaminate to the grape, and then we might have issues with our consumers. So, I oftentimes tell facilities and farms to map out their flow, map out their production flow, especially, for those grapes that you have most control over that you're going to be sending to the fresh market, that mapping out that flow of your production, okay, and your packaging will help you identify those food contact surfaces. That's where we need to be most vigilant in regards to cleaning and sanitizing, and then identify those adjacent areas and what we identify as non-food contact surfaces. So I show these pictures as just a way to depict, the different types of food contact surfaces, the conveyor belts, the sides of the conveyor. And then like Chip mentioned, we're not dealing with mechanical harvesters here. We're dealing with humans harvesting each of these grapes. And the fact that we can't harvest them in clusters, we're touching each of those grapes. So hand washing is going to be extremely critical in regards to, reducing the microbial risk of contamination. So first and foremost, identify those food contact surfaces. And then finally, or I think another thing, the important thing to talk about is, the differences between cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting. And this is something that COVID-19 did bring about was, we got a lot of calls, from growers and facilities. What does it mean to disinfect? Can I disinfect food contact surfaces? And I think it's so very important to understand the differences in these terms because they all relate to each other and they actually impact each other, the definitions of these terms anyway. So when we think about cleaning, all right, it's the physical removal of soil and food residue from a surface, which includes the use of clean water and a detergent. Okay, so we're physically removing soil, food residue, okay, in preparation for that sanitation step. Cleaning, the target surface is all surfaces should be cleaned, okay? Now, when we think about sanitizing, all right, what do we mean by that? That's actually the removal or the reduction of the number of microorganisms of public health significance. So pathogens, for example, all right. Ideally we're removing, anywhere from 99.999% on a food contact surface. And on our non-food contact surfaces, we're hopefully removing at least 99.9%, okay? So when we sanitize, again, we want to make sure we're starting with a clean surface. If we sanitize a dirty surface, I can almost guarantee you that you're throwing your money away because your sanitizer isn't effective. Okay, so first clean and then sanitize those food contact surfaces. And then when we talk about disinfect, okay, so what's the difference between sanitize and disinfect, and why is that important now in this, this era of COVID-19? So disinfecting means the treatment of a clean surface to destroy or inactivate all infectious organisms on hard surfaces within 10 minutes. So now we're upping the ante on what we're actually doing to that surface and reducing those microbial organisms. So for sanitizing, we might be reducing certain pathogens, certain organisms, whereas disinfecting, we're removing all viable and infectious organisms, such as not only bacteria, but also viruses, as well as some fungal spores. So in a typical situation, especially in the food industry, for disinfecting, we're going to target non-food contact surfaces, particularly those high touch surfaces. So this is when we talk about, in reducing that risk of COVID-19 and reducing the risk of transmission of that virus, we really want to focus on those high touch surfaces like doorknobs, handrails, maybe it's an iPhone or an iPad, that you're using for those transactions and selling those grapes at a fresh market or at your pick your own market. So disinfecting really geared towards those high touch surfaces rather than food contact surfaces. So as far as food contact surfaces, it's the cleaning and sanitizing that we really want to focus on. But what's so very important to understand when you get into these chemicals, it's so important to follow the label. In fact, the label is the law, okay? Because many of these or all of these sanitizers that we're using in the food industry are considered antimicrobial pesticides, okay? So they have been registered through the EPA. And again, following that, the directions on that label is actually following the law, and it's actually following a validated method that you can be more assured that it's actually effective on the surface that you are trying to clean, and it's safe for the actual user of that product, okay? So one thing to look for, there's many things to look for in this label, but one thing to make sure you're looking for is its intended use. Are you using it? Are you using the sanitizer for a food contact surface or a non-food contact surface? That's going to, that will tell you what the concentration should be at and whether or not there should be a rinse water or water rinse after application of that particular chemical. Okay, so it's going to tell you how much of that sanitizer to use, how long that contact time should be on that surface, and whether or not you have to do a clean water rinse. Okay, when it comes to disinfectants, okay, so very important to follow that label, not only to assure proper use of that chemical, okay, but keep in mind when we use chemicals at the disinfectant level, we're oftentimes using it at a much higher concentration for a much longer time. And oftentimes, if not always, okay, the label will direct you to rinse with clean water, rinse that surface, okay? So if you choose, okay, to disinfect a food contact surface, right? Make sure you are following up with a clean water rinse. The bottom line is to make sure you're following that EPA label, okay? Again, in most cases, food contact surfaces will not need a disinfection step. They'll need cleaning as well as sanitizing. Now, to be assured that, if you're targeting those high touch surfaces for disinfection, okay, in regards to, these days, we really want to target and make sure that we're reducing the risk of COVID-19, right? And to be assured that the sanitizer or the disinfectant that you're using, okay, is effective against SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, you can refer to what's known as EPA's List N, okay? You can simply Google this, EPA list N. This is a list of approved sanitizers as well as disinfectants that are indeed effective against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes the disease COVID-19. All right, and so that kind of is a segue into, I would love to say we can just skip these next two slides because we're over this, but unfortunately, it just seems like COVID-19 will not go away. And in fact, we're living through a time now where, the number of cases are actually increasing by the day because of the variants that we're dealing with, particularly the Delta variant. So this is something that we cannot let go of. We can't, sort of dismiss this yet. But I think it is important that we need to address this, not only to keep our own employees, our workers safe, but also to keep those visitors to our farms safe as well. One thing that I think it's very important to note and to remind everyone is that COVID-19 is a respiratory disease, okay? So this virus, SARS-CoV-2, is known as a respiratory virus. And the question is, well, how is that different from a food safety illness, okay? In almost all cases, okay, foodborne disease is going to be a GI or a gastrointestinal disease, meaning that it's going to cause diarrhea, cause vomiting. Those are typically the two most common symptoms of foodborne disease. Foodborne disease is not considered a respiratory disease, whereas COVID-19, again, is a respiratory or caused by a respiratory virus. It's transmitted, we know through research and science that has been completed in the past year and a half, that it's most commonly transmitted through aerosol transmission of droplets. So coughing, sneezing, exhaling, that's why it becomes so very important to, keep your distance, or, for those perhaps who are not vaccinated, to wear that mask to reduce that risk of transmission. Person-to-person contact, okay, is another factor that can increase transmission. And then we've learned, certainly the virus, this particular virus, does have the potential to spread through contact with contaminated surfaces. So it kind of supports the idea of, disinfecting those high-touch surfaces. But keep in mind, truly the number one routes of transmission here goes back to contact with each other, coughing, sneezing, that person-to-person contact. Most contagious when patients are symptomatic, but certainly can be spread before symptoms appear, so those asymptomatic cases out there certainly provide a headache for us in trying to reduce or control the spread of this virus. Those of us who are walking around not knowing that we actually are carrying the virus. And then important to note that the incubation period is anywhere from 2 to 14 days following exposure. So again, that's another hurdle that certainly makes control of this virus that much harder when we have such a long incubation period. So what can we do about that on the farm? So what are some of the sort of preventative measures that we can take? Just a few here that we've listed, and when we get to the Q&A or the discussion of this particular presentation, we'd love to hear from other growers and farms out there. What have you done, to reduce that risk of transmission? But looking at just 7 points here. One, monitor employees for symptoms. I think many of us, I'm sure every one of us, have gone into some facility or some building, institution, wherever it might be, where we've been asked those number of questions. Have you been exposed to anyone who's had COVID? Do you have the symptoms? Maybe they even checked your temperature. Those are the same type of preventive measures that farms can actually take on their own in their own operation as well. Second point here, workers should cough or sneeze in their elbow with a disposable tissue, and that tissue should be discarded immediately in a suitable waste container so that it's not adding to the spread of the virus. But just something it goes back to what Chip talked about in one of the first slides talking about food safety. And that's regards to training our employees, reminding them of what's important, and then providing signage reminders for our customers who are on our pick your own markets. Employees should practice social distancing when possible and practical. So, we've heard this, I think we've heard this a lot, stay at least 6 feet away from others to reduce that risk of transmission. Fourth point here, and I'll reiterate what Chip said, hand washing. We can't say it enough how important hand washing truly is. And not only just, doing the hand washing, but actually doing it correctly. So applying soap and water and, creating that lather for at least 20 seconds, followed by a clean water rinse. In regards to food safety, looking at point number 5 here, we often, will say that hand sanitizers do not replace hand washing. And I'll reiterate that here too. The number one, thing you can do is wash your hands. And for COVID-19, fortunately, hand sanitizers, those alcohol-based hand sanitizers, have proven to be very effective against the type of virus that SARS-CoV-2 is. So hand washing followed by a sanitizer is probably the best route to go. But for COVID-19, if all else fails, okay, at least have your employees and your customers use a hand sanitizer. For food safety, it all goes back to hand washing. Soap and water for food safety and reducing foodborne disease is certainly the way to go for foodborne disease. High touch areas should be disinfected at least daily. So go back, and again, map the flow of your product, pinpoint those areas where you do have high touch surfaces, because that's where you really want to focus in on disinfecting those types of surfaces. And then routine cleaning, okay, is very important. It should continue in the pack house as normal, unless, for this case, wherever your retail market is and where you have those food contact surfaces, unless there is a confirmed COVID-19 positive, then all surfaces should be disinfected, not just your high touch surfaces, but certainly those adjacent surfaces as well, and wherever that individual came in contact with. So you kind of have to do your own investigation if you do have the unfortunate case where you've had someone positive on your operation. So this is just taking a look at a picture, of how we can handle that in actual fresh markets. This is a picture, I think, taken by Chip actually at a farmer's market, just looking at ways that they've taken to reduce that risk of COVID-19. So looking at, keeping your distance among people, so that 6 feet, space between people. And again, washing your hands, we can't say that enough. Like Chip talked about, no sampling. Okay, so refrain from sampling products just to limit that, of course, that hand to mouth, contact for sure, and leaving contaminated surfaces behind. And then again, they pointed out here, cover your mouth and nose. So signage can be an effective training tool and effective for reminders as well. All right, we'd be happy to take any questions. Both Chip and I appreciate your attention and happy to answer any questions or discuss how you've handled food safety measures on your particular farm.
Great, thank you, Chip and Lynette. That was great. Feel free to send your questions through the chat if you have some. I have one question, maybe directed at Chip, but you both might be able to address, is just if customers for Pick Your Own are allowed to bring their own food in, and is that a food safety concern? Is that restricted?
So the recommendation that we normally make is that there be a designated area for eating. So, certainly for the workers, they would need to have their lunch or whatever, and there should be a designated area for that. And again, before the workers go back, they should wash their hands before they go back to pick produce. Same could be set up for visitors to the farm. You could have an area, rocking chairs on the front porch or something like that, that they can go sit down and have a snack, sit back, and take a break, but then they should wash their hands before going back out there.
There's a question in the chat. It would be helpful to have some recommended labeled sanitizing, disinfecting chemicals. I'm assuming that my chlorine bleach is not labeled. Are there any specific products you recommend, or is there an easily accessible list that you could tell people about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most common one would be bleach, right? Chlorine as a sanitizer. Okay. Keep in mind, we kind of separated those cleaning and sanitizing steps out. So just keep in mind that first clean, which, you can use is simple detergents as Dawn or Simple Green, for example, that's readily available on the market. And then, many growers we know use chlorine in this case. Another type of sanitizer would be what's known as peroxyacetic acid, which has also been known to be very effective. And it's a little, I'll go to and say, it's a little more reliable. For chlorine, we have to worry about pH, we have to worry about organic matter in the water, the turbidity of that water, in order for that chlorine to be effective. Whereas PAA is a little more resilient in regards to its efficacy. So
I know that in a household situation, the Clorox, the bleach container says, dilute it 1 to 10. Is that like a sort of standard thing, or is that not enough for what you would want to do for, say, surfaces at your checkout area?
So it goes back to, what you're doing, right? And it goes back to the label. So, for food contact surfaces, you're going to have a much less concentration of chlorine versus if you're disinfecting that surface. So let's say you do have a COVID-19 event on your farm, and that an individual who was indeed infected handled certain food contact surfaces. That's where we need to go back and understand that difference between, disinfecting and sanitizing, and follow the label according to the disinfection procedures. So you can find those concentrations readily through the CDC, which I feel remiss that I didn't include that on a slide, but we'd be happy to get that information to you, Debbie, so you can share that. But it goes back to, what do we do if we're concerned about an event, an incident like COVID-19, or, maybe we've, many of us have probably had to deal with vomit, and those kind of incidences. That's another example of where we have to go in and disinfect, because the dose of infection is so much higher on those surfaces versus food contact surfaces, which with the day-to-day use, of grapes and, what we assume non-infected people handling. Okay.
So we have a question from one of our participants.
Can I jump? Can I jump in here really quick, Debbie?
Sure.
And I think Kyle has set it up so that I can share my screen. So one of the resources that we always suggest, if you Google Produce Safety Alliance and you go to their general resource listing, if you come down here for labeled sanitizers for produce, it's an Excel tool. This has been updated pretty recently, November of 2020. And then if you stop sharing and try to start sharing that. This is a fantastic resource that has the different types of EPA labeled product name. They have the trade names, the sub-labels, and you can actually go over here and look at what the active ingredients are. They actually have label information for all of that. And so if you're using a particular chemical, you can go use the spreadsheet to look up and find what find that chemical and what it's approved for being used for, whether it's for food contact surfaces, if it needs to be rinsed, like Lynette was talking about, and things like that. And then specifically, as Lynette said, specifically for COVID, they're the EPA list in disinfectants. And so you can just Google that as EPA list in and be able to get that information as well.
Yeah,
So
that's
two
good.
really good resources.
Yeah, thanks, Chip. And the other thing to mention too is, you want to make sure, chlorine is commonly used, okay, because it is so widely available and it's one of the cheaper sanitizers and disinfectants as well. Just make sure you're not using, the lavender scented or the splashless version of bleach. You want to focus, really look for the germicidal bleach that's been approved for food contact surfaces. So again, for food contact surfaces, forget the scents, the citrus and the lavender, even though it does smell good, but it's not approved for food contact surfaces.
So the question that showed up in the chat from Susan Bland, we use a contractor to pick our grapes. We have 3/4 of an acre, and I have a hard time keeping the buckets off the ground. What's a good method to have something they can put the buckets on, or does using the plastic bag help with that?
So I can try to tackle that. Certainly the plastic bag helps with that, but some of the recommendations that we've made for strawberry growers, and I think it's applicable here, is if you have containers, buckets that they're harvesting into, just put a bucket inside of a bucket. Have a colored bucket, like a blue bucket, that would contact the ground, and have your white buckets or silver buckets or some other color that would go inside those, so that bucket would never actually touch the ground. And that would help with that. But certainly the plastic bags inside the containers also help with that, because that plastic bag would never touch the ground. One of the reasonings for that is that there could be contaminants on the ground, and oftentimes we may see people either pick that container up and put their hand underneath it, and then their hands are contaminated, or either bringing that harvest container up and sitting it, when they're checking out of a pick your own, they would sit it on the counter, and then the counter is contaminated. So it's really important to have some type of system to avoid having what's on the ground get onto other surfaces. And those are a couple of suggestions we've made that have worked well for folks in the past.
Now I'm going to have to start being really careful about my own harvest containers, which I put on the ground all the time and then bring them in and put them on the kitchen counter, right? So can you clarify whether any of these food safety things are important for people who are picking their grapes and they're going to go for wine? They can be hand harvesting grapes, but the purpose of them is for wine rather than for fresh eating.
Yeah, so because it's going to go to wine, all right, it's going to go through what's known as a kill step, all right, or it's going to be commercially processed, all right. So the fortunate thing there is we don't have to be, gosh, I hate to say this, but we don't have to be so picky with food safety sanitation measures, or, in food safety measures in general, okay. So, talking about mechanical harvesters, for example, I know Chip has talked about this before, but mechanical harvesters are indeed, hard to clean, hard to sanitize those food contact surfaces, which, and they're harder on the actual produce as well. But, that's why for processing, such as winemaking, we can use those mechanical harvesters. But still, Debbie, to your point, I think we still have to include those food safety sanitation or food safety measures, even if it's going to go towards commercial processing. And I can talk about the microbial load and why that's so important. And then if we don't consider, food safety from the get-go, from the farm level, then we might be putting ourselves in a bind, because our process, okay, that's validated to kill those bacteria may not be actually effective, because the quality of those grapes to begin with were subpar, if that makes any sense. But, as far as drops go, there is a leeway, because it's going to be going to wine. We can use those drops because it does have that commercial process. But definitely not ideal for that situation.
And I think that you
Yep,
still have to know that not necessarily every grape you pick, you may have kind of a split market of where things go, and you still are going to have to think about person to person issues and transmission amongst your workers and anybody who's there on the farm. So
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the other ways to think about it, to kind of reiterate what Lynette was saying is, if you think about having multiple food safety barriers along the way, your education for your workers about health and hygiene, the hand washing stations, appropriate restrooms, and all the rest, if you kind of throw all that out the window for the processed, you're relying on that one final barrier for food safety. And so by throwing all of these others out or paying less attention to them, you put a lot of confidence and a lot of strain on that last step. And with that last step, if there's any breakdown at all in that, then you're going to have a food safety issue. So even with processing, you should really try to keep those same food safety measures in place throughout, so that you'll have a multi-barrier approach to food safety across the entire way.
I'm interested to hear from the growers who are on this session here. And you have to unmute yourself to answer, or else you can use the chat. But for those of you who have been selling other crops during the course of the spring and summer, I mean, muscadines are kind of late in the season. Everybody should have their kinks worked out by then. But if you have had other crops, I'm curious to know what you have seen of customer attitudes, of whether the people are showing up at your farm as much as they were last year, which was a boom year for direct market. And also, I'm curious to know, what's been working for you. What signs, what techniques, what's worked for you, or times when you wish you'd had a snappy comeback to somebody saying something incredibly awful that you now have come up with that you'd care to share with us. So I would like to invite the other folks on here to unmute yourself and speak up, because you have a lot of expertise with your customers and with your crop that we'd all like to hear about.
Well, Debbie, this is Deborah Blanton.
Yes.
And listen, I just have muscadines, so I can't think of anything snappy. We all have those instances happen. But I do want to thank you for showing the picture from my vineyard with the couple and their 3 children. That was mine, and I'm so glad you're using it. And it was a great example because they had bags that were in the white buckets, and they left their bucket with me and took the muscadines that they'd picked in the bag. So that is a brilliant example of what I think the folks here are advocating.
Now, did you supply the bags to them, or did they thoughtfully bring their own bags?
Oh, no. I supply the bags.
Okay.
And I have the bag in the bucket when they come, and I say, here you go. You fill up the bucket. Of course, sometimes it ends up they can do more muscadines in the bag because I use these big T-shirt bags. But anyway, that's okay. They leave happy with sanitized muscadines.
Other comments?
Yeah,
We have
so
another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to point out that one of the other folks that's on the call today, on the webinar today, is Elena Rogers. Elena is my counterpart in the West. So I have 51 counties in the East. Elena has the West. you know, she's a great resource for those folks that are in the West, as well as Lynette and I. So I'm glad she joined us.
You broke up a little bit, but I know we heard the part of mentioning Elena and introducing her, so we see her on the screen. So thank you, Elena, for joining.
Thank you. So, no, I just wanted to second everything they've said, and please, if there's anything I can do, I'm around. So, no, I'm here to help you. Thank you. Thank you, Chip.
Another comment in the chat. I've always washed my grapes prior to packaging and cooling, but food safety recommendation is not to do that. How do others clean leaves, debris, and stray insects from their grapes before packaging? Thoughts on that? Recommendations from you folks? What do y'all do? Penny?
You know, I'm going to say I'd wash them, but getting cautions from the food safety people. And we've done experiments in the past, and we have no problem with washing muscadine. Sometimes we'll add 150 parts per million of bleach as well. Doesn't seem to matter with muscadine to me. What few experiments we've done, it doesn't seem to matter with the bleach or not the bleach. The big problem, I guess, is when you're at a wash step, you aren't entering a different realm of the food safety rules. And this is kind of why I hesitate to say to do it. You're going to have another layer of regulations to whenever you start applying water to a crop that doesn't normally require water as per the FSMA rules. So I can't say, how do you get rid of the leaves? Some people have in the past used blueberry sorters to do that part. And so normally we never talk about using food or packing lines for small fruits, but muscadine and blueberry are exceptions where you can use them. So my get around for this is if you have a small sorting unit, you might want to try that. If you have an old blueberry line, this might be something to do. Of course, then you just open the door to another long list of how to clean your packing equipment and sorting equipment. So no, I don't have a perfect answer for you on this one.
It does seem to me that if you're going to wash them, you want to wash them in clean water, like running water, so that you're not dipping your next batch of grapes into the water from the first batch of grapes and taking whatever was on the bad grapes.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because I do remember the days when you had a children's wading pool of water and you were just throwing stuff in and taking it out. Don't do that. You know, when I'm thinking washing, I'm thinking of running water as a spray system basically over the grapes, so that you're always using clean water, potable water, not trying to reuse water from a bucket sort of thing.
Okay. The
Yeah,
suggestion here.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. One of the comments was, could you use a heavy fan? And I was just going to say that, you know, with blueberry harvesters, with the grape harvesters that are used for vineyards, that's one of the steps. As they're being harvested, there's a box fan that the grapes or the berries go over, and that blows that initial larger trash, the leaves, any other debris, any of the sticks that were left in it, or stray insects out of it. And those, you know, are blown basically from the bottom up and blown out, you know, so that you may be able to use something like that for some of that heavier debris before you package them.
Bugs out.
Yeah, if you have the opportunity to keep your operation dry, do it, okay? Because once you introduce water, now you're allowing for, you know, bacteria need water in order to grow. They can hang around in dry environments, but once you introduce water in the mix, now they're having a party. So keep dry environments dry, if at all possible, for sure.
That could even be said for you know, cleaning food contact surfaces and things like that. There are techniques for dry cleaning. Mm-hmm. So if you know, if at all possible, if you don't add water, they don't as Lynette said, have a party.
Do you have any other comments or questions from this group? It does seem that Muscadine, direct market, pick your own, has nowhere near the amount of crowding and stress that you see in strawberries. With just, first crop of the season, everybody's out there, all their little kids are there leaping over the rows. It's a simpler crop. And I think we're lucky about that. So I think that's a good thing. I wanted to remind you all that we do have some workshops coming up over the course of August that are oriented towards home gardeners and consumers. And we really are using these really to build excitement about muscadines amongst the folks that are your customers. I mean, if folks decide they want to make wine, even if you're a winemaker, all the better. They can make some wine, it won't come out very good. They're going to come back and buy your wine. If they grow their own grapes, they're probably not going to grow enough of them, so they're going to come buy your grapes too. And their friends and relatives are going to get excited about grapes. So we encourage you to promote these workshops with your customers, with your friends, with your non-grape growing people. On August 11th and 14th, that's a Wednesday and Saturday, it'll be about backyard muscadine production, growing your own. And on August 18th and 21, that's again Wednesday and Saturday, it's making your own muscadine wine, with the first of those oriented towards outright beginners and the second towards people who have some experience making their own wine. So this is the first time the Muscadine Association has done something like this, as far as I know. And everybody's familiarity with using Zoom and having online education has really made it more possible. Just like it has for this. And I've put the link for that, but it's in the events section of our website. And Kyle has shared that link again with you. So you just go to ncmuscadinegrape.org and it's easy to find. Any final words of wisdom from anybody? Otherwise, I think we're pretty much done. Kyle, anything to say? Anybody? So.
Nothing from my end. Thank you to our speakers. It was great hearing about those updates and useful information throughout the summer as harvest kicks into gear soon.
Yeah, this is really helpful. I really appreciate the expertise that you folks have shared with us. A lot to think about. So, thanks again, and y'all have a great rest of the afternoon and evening, and watch those grapes ripen as they're starting to change.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.